at the end of the day, I don't produce any sound when I conduct. They are the ones who create that special magic. And for that, limited amount of time, we have that possibility collectively reach a certain level that's probably not possible for each one of us individually to get. That's the magic of orchestras.
Welcome to Arts Engines. I am your host, Aaron Dworkin, and with us today as our guest, we have Dmitry Sitkovetsky, who is violinist, conductor, and music director of the Greensboro Symphony, one of our artistic creative partners of Arts Engines, and his contributions to our field have been truly extraordinary. Dima, it is so wonderful to be able to have you on the show.
It's great to be here. And I'm really honored to be here.
Awesome. So, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but I thought one, first off, is that you've had, this incredible experience to perform and to conduct on multiple continents, potentially every continent. And so you have really gained, I think, a global perspective on the arts. And what I'm curious is, do you see a difference of different nations that you go to and engage your artistry with? Do you find that there's a different way in which we engage with the arts here in the United States versus Europe, versus Russia, versus Asia, different nations? I'm just curious if you find that there's a different kind of sense and role that you see the arts playing based on the nation that you're in.
Absolutely. And Aaron, it was very telling now that we are in this most unusual, most extraordinary circumstances where all of a sudden everything came to a halt. Nobody was doing anything. It's very significant which countries actually got themselves together, and very soon after all the, barriers that you're not allowed to congregate and this and that. But look, Germany, of course, predictably, where the arts play such an important role, Germany, Austria, Switzerland, they seem to be already performing, with all the precautions and the limited audience, or sometimes no audience at all, Concertgebouw and all that. Japan seems to be, again, in pretty good shape. I'm supposed to go there in October. And surprisingly, even a country like Romania, where I'm supposed to go, to a UNESCO competition and also to play there. So it's very significant how different parts of the world, especially, of course, parts of Europe, where the government, the state, the land, the city supports, so they can actually afford to put on performances with a very few members of the audience, putting musicians safely on stage, doing creative things. In Berlin, they did an opera in a parking lot. I mean, how is that? And it had tremendous success and desire. There's a great deal of appetite for that. From my experience, it's true. I've been pretty much all over the globe. And it's fascinating to see how public reacts, the attention span, the importance of the arts, different on different continents. But ultimately, the good audience you find almost everywhere, because the great thing about music that we need no words. It's the only international language. It really is from heart to heart. Music has no difference in age, in religion, in color of the skin, in the background, whether you are well prepared, you're really in the know, or this is your first time, being exposed to music. I remember a fantastic experience in Charlottesville, Virginia. They have this wonderful in Cable Hall, University of Virginia. They have a wonderful program as well as children concerts. So my jumbo orchestra, which performed the night before, We did two two 1 hour shows. Of course, it was just bits from here and there. And I made a little experiment. I put 8-year-old girl in my place in conducting, on the podium. And I just conducted with her little hand, the orchestra. It was a miraculous experience. I mean, she was in the center of all the music, and it seemed like she was commanding it, and they were following her and everything. I wish there was, sort of like being baptized by the waves of music. It was an extraordinary experience. Every time I think of it, it's like, so there's no, ultimately, the experience of being exposed to music could be just as strong. I remember my chamber orchestra gave most memorable concerts in little fishing villages of Finland for an audience of, 40, 50 people. Compare that with Hollywood Bowl of 12,000 people. But it's not the numbers, it's the connection.
So that, it makes me think that experience that you created for that young girl, I'm curious, going back to your own childhood, what was the spark that created it for you? Obviously, you come from a true legacy of music and musicians, but I'm wondering, do you remember when that moment was for you that you realized this power and the pull that music was going to have for you?
Oh, absolutely. It's very interesting because I think, babies, even in mother's womb, they respond to the sounds around them. And my mother being Bela Davidovich, one of the most celebrated pianists of last century, she told me that she performed in public up until one evening when she played Beethoven's first piano concerto. And in the last movement, there's a I started to move in her womb so much that she actually had to, she was further from the piano that she was comfortable. And after that, she stopped performing. But you obviously responded to that in my womb. And it's interesting because when my wife Susan was pregnant with Julia, with our daughter, we were in Israel, and I performed 9 times Prokofiev's first violin concerto. And Prokofiev, ever since Julia started to understand something later on, became one of her favorite composers. It's interesting because the exposure, even while the child is still, so in my case, I was at a great advantage, of course, having music all around me, and it would have been very strange if I didn't become a musician, though it does come with a lot of pressure and a lot of expectations, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. And now my daughter, the next generation, I had 4 generations. She now has 5 generations of pressure and fear not to do as well as the parents and grandparents and grandparents and so forth. But of course, it's a great advantage. The more you are exposed to music, you don't have to become a professional musician, but you will always have a connection with it. I cannot stress enough, and this is one of the main, sort of mission statements of Greensboro Symphony, is to bring that music even to people. I talk to little kids who come to a concert, they never heard of the symphony before, and then they meet the conductor, they meet the soloist. It's a great way of, awakening their feeling.
So it's interesting, talking about that impact and how that exposure at a young age. And certainly, here in the States, and we're in the midst of all kinds of, racial, cultural turmoil and all of that.
Yeah.
But certainly in classical music, we have a history of not being completely welcoming, and of certainly not having the representation that I think all of us really want. And one of the things I've noticed, right, is you have been, one of these leaders in bringing artists of color to Greensboro, to, to communities where otherwise it may be the artist you bring may be the first artist of color, classical performer that an audience or community has seen because of this historical context we've had. I'm just curious how you've thought about that and why you think that's important, and what kind of role music can play in these social issues that we face.
Absolutely. Well, Greensboro is an interesting town. That's where a lot of there's a civil rights museum right there downtown, and it's really been a very important place for breaking the barriers. And traditionally somehow Greensboro, which is quite different from this triad of High Point, which is still the center of furniture market and all of that. And then you have Winston-Salem, which is quite different. It's only half an hour away. It's the same airport for all three. But the history of integrating various, cultures is very different from each one. And I think Greensboro is really quite ahead, and people are much more ready to, to include and not to make any difference. Because I personally, I grew up with, believe me, it was not only the Beatles outside of classical music, but a great jazz. My goodness, I mean, my gods were Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington and Ella Fitzgerald and whatever. Whenever I have the time, I always listen to that. And then further on, the great American contribution to the 20th century has been jazz, soul and rock, which is so, that's where when I went to Memphis and I went to the, Rock and Soul Museum, actually, there is this quite remarkable how these two seemingly completely different cultures merged long before the civil rights movement and everything, and enriched each other and produced great musicians. Then, of course, Broadway musical, which probably was before that. And, this is what we have. You have many different, East European Jews, you have Germans, you have Italians, you have Irish. America should really be way ahead of all of that. But of course, it's easier said than done.
True. And so, it's interesting talking about all these different genres of music, right? There are definitely those in our classical music field who come from a space of purists, right? They're like, we get only let's not have any, we don't want rock influences in our music. We don't want, what do you think about the influences of other genres in the classical sphere?
I think it's tremendous. I think if you talk to the great jazz musicians or great rock musicians or pop musicians, they've been influenced by classical music tremendously, and many of them were classically trained. But on the other side of the spectrum, I was in this so-called elite central music school, in Moscow, where all the big talents from everywhere, from Kiev, from Leningrad, Baku, and Yerevan, they would always come there. But we listened every break between the lessons, it's 45-minute lesson, 15-minute pause. Somebody would come to the piano and play either jazz or, some of the rock when it started. The Soviet rock, I was pretty much involved because my first cousin, Alexander Sitkovetsky, was the head of one of the most important and most popular rock groups. So, and that was very much underground at that time. So it seemed also almost like dissident kind of a movement. And then the Beatles, I could tell you year by year which album came out. And then, of course, everything that was great, made by the great talent. But I will never forget when we first met about 10 years ago, or no, 6-7 years ago in Napa, and the Sphinx Ensemble, which is a wonderful, wonderful group, which I had later also much closer connection. But at that time, there were two soloists. I mean, absolutely world-class talent. It was Julia Bullock, this singer, and the one who just came to us last year and created a sensation, Xavier Foley, who is really one of a kind.
He dominates the stage.
It really is. I was completely bowled over. I mean, what a talent. And also the people there, and that was wonderful. Kelly Hope Thompson, who led. She's wonderful violinist, great person. So I was very taken. And for me, in any case, I always being a Russian Jew in Russia, I was always part of the minority. And we were never, officially we all had equal opportunities, but in practice, in order to become somebody, you had to be not just as good, not just a little bit better. You had to be 5 times better in order to, and then have the luck and sometimes somebody's good, push or opportunity to show what you can. So it's a struggle. But I've always been a proud member of minorities anyway. I'm sure I'll die as a minority of some kind.
So unfortunately, we're even running short on time, but one key question I wanted to kind of talk about, which was that, of course, you've mentioned this role that you've had as a conductor. And I wanted to see kind of different from, really being an interpretive artist, right? Being on stage and playing as an instrumentalist, but actually being in the leadership role and, serving as music director at Greensboro. What I'm curious is, what are those aspects that you think are important that you can do in a leadership role that you can't necessarily do when you're just the soloist? Are there things that you feel, or responsibilities even, that you feel you bear when you're in a leadership role?
Absolutely. I think the most satisfying for me to be, there are 2 things. First of all, to create your own sound. It's not, just me being, but it's the effect that a personality has on a group of people. And when there is a glue, there's a certain ethics of even a certain material thing that you can feel. What always seemed to be incredible when I heard Sitkovetsky, or the great conductors, how they conducted the same orchestras that I knew, that I performed with, that I conducted with, but they just sounded like Philadelphia, of the Philadelphia sound of Sitkovetsky. For me, that was quite miraculous. So that was one thing that I was trying to achieve. The other thing, I love when I'm able to, just by being there, to raise everybody's standard to a different plateau. If I'm able, it's not important to, even be sometimes specific about this, or this is a little bit out of tune, or this is not quite together, but just the energy, the enthusiasm. You have to lead by example, and you have to convey your love for that particular piece of music. And then you have to also be receptive to whatever ideas, because at the end of the day, I don't produce any sound when I conduct. They are the ones who create that special magic. And for that, limited amount of time, we have that possibility collectively reach a certain level that's probably not possible for each one of us individually to get. That's the magic of orchestras. And for me, that's always been a great thrill and the aim.
I just love how you just captured that power of the ensemble under the leadership of a great maestro. Dima, thank you so much. You truly are one of the great arts engines that is powering human creativity in our field. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
Thanks so much, Aaron, for having me. It was great joy. Thank you.